This is a book by a friend of mine, Roland Bohr. I'm pretty sure he's not going to complain if I try to read it to you and talk about the book. Actually, to be fair, this book and Roland himself have had quite a bit of influence on me and my perspective of archery and the ideas of traditional archery and how it's an adaptive technology, or it's a technology that has been adapted or adapted to, borrowed, that sort of thing. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to read the preface, and like I said, I'm pretty sure he's not going to complain. This book was published in 2014, so depending on when it was, the date it was actually published, we'll say 6 years. I'm going to apologize in advance because I'm going to butcher a lot of names, and some of them are just, they're going to tie my tongue up, and I apologize in advance. And I'm not that great of a reader. This is a scholarly book, so it's not widely distributed. Another reason why I think Dr. Bohr will be fine with me reading this. The first copy I got to read was the one he lent me, because he only had one copy himself. Now, this one came from one of his students. So the title of the book is Gift from the Thunder Beings, and what it is Indigenous Archery and European Firearms in the Northern Plains and Central Subarctic, 1670 to 1870. So this book is basically about Roland's work and his studies, and how technically it's actually about how he came to live here in Winnipeg, because that's where his studies took him. Now, on the back of the book, there's a quotation from Dr. Laura Peers, a curator of the Americas at Pitt Rivers Museum and reader in the School of Anthropology and Museum Ethnography at the University of Oxford. I don't know the woman, so I will, yeah. Aboriginal weapons are an important subject in themselves, and for their role within Native societies and Native-white relations. Roland Bohr's knowledge of how our Aboriginal weapons work and why they are constructed as they were allows the author to critique the ethnocentric and technologically ignorant assumptions of many earlier scholars. As a bowyer himself, Bohr brings knowledge of making and using bows and arrows, lacking in their earlier scholarship in his careful historic research. So, I'm going to read the preface. Now, this study examines North American or Aboriginal people's use of indigenous and European distant weapons in big game hunting and combat from the beginning of the fur trade in the Hudson's Bay Company trading territory, so what now is Canada, in the late 17th century to the treaty and reserve period that began in Canada in the 1870s. It compares the northern Great Plains and the central subarctic to adjacent but environmentally very different regions of North America and their respective indigenous cultures. Technological change and the impacts of European contact were not uniform throughout North America. Aboriginal people in the northern plains and the central subarctic became much involved in the fur trade, and from the early 1700s on had to deal with European newcomers. But they did so in divergent ways. Because Aboriginal people in both regions were affected by and participated in the fur trade, a comparative examination of continuality and the change in their hunting methods and hunting equipment, as well as patterns of violent conflict, can shed more light on their history and the history of Aboriginal European relations. Wherever possible, this examination focuses closely, but not exclusively, on the Omishkego Cree, aka Swampy Cree. I will be probably substituting Swampy Cree from here simply because the Omishkego, I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. and I apologize. I truly, honestly apologize if I am mispronouncing it. Exemplifying Central Subarctic Aboriginal peoples, and on the Blackfoot as an exemplary Aboriginal group from the Northern Plains. The Swampy Cree were chosen because they had a relatively long and quite early exposure to the fur trade and the changes it brought. The Blackfoot provide a good example of Plains cultures because their acquisition of horses and firearms was said to have been a crucial factor in their westward and southward expansion, causing important shifts in military and political tensions and relations between Aboriginal peoples in the Northern Plains. My interest in North American Aboriginal peoples' history began with a fascination with their material culture. Intrigued by the controversies surrounding the relative effectiveness of Aboriginal technologies in comparison to European tools and weapons, I found that much of the sparse information on Aboriginal weapons was either overlooked or misinterpreted by historians of the fur trade. To gain a more realistic understanding of their capabilities, I began in 1992 to manufacture working reproductions of Aboriginal artifacts, such as moccasins, containers, tools, bows, arrows. Through a Fulbright grant at the University of North Dakota in Grand Forks in 1995-1996, I had the chance to study the history, archaeology, and material culture of the Mandan, the Hidasta, the Archery, and the Lakota. I got the Lakota part right. There, I began to seek information from Aboriginal people themselves in order to compare it with information from other sources and to integrate it into my practical studies on Aboriginal material culture. Soon after I began my doctoral studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg in 1999, I met Mr. Louis Bird, a Swampy Cree elder from, I apologize for this, Pewanuck, Ontario, hopefully I got that right, who had been active in collecting his people's traditions, legends, and histories for over 30 years. My conversations and cooperation with Louis Bird had a formative influence on my work. So far, my interest had been mainly directed towards plain Aboriginal peoples, but he brought me to study subarctic peoples as well. Through these conversations, I realized that a significant amount of information on traditional subarctic Aboriginal archery has survived in Swampy Cree oral traditions, and through people's continued use of bows and arrows in hunting. But because of a widespread assumption that traditional archery had quickly disappeared after the opening of direct trade between the coastal Cree and the Hudson Bay Company in 1668 and 1669-ish, academic researchers have never before asked Swampy Cree historians like Louis Bird about these topics. Another realization that came from working with Louis Bird was that subarctic people's response to European tools and weapons, and their way of integrating these new items in their own technology, although appearing similar on the surface, very different from those Aboriginal groups in the Northern Plains. Comparing these different Aboriginal cultures in regard to their usage of Indigenous and European technology has led me to a more thorough understanding of these adaptive processes and Aboriginal people's responses to them. A brief survey of the subarctic and Northern Plains environments and the most common subsistence strategies in these regions near the time of contact, this will be in Chapter 2, but there's parentheses, provides the context for a more detailed examination of Aboriginal distant weapons. In Chapter 3 and 4, Chapter 4 also examines social and cultural aspects of the manufacture of arrows. Chapter 5 introduces the 5 major types of firearms that became available to Aboriginal people through the fur trade. Its main focus is on muzzle-loading smooth-bore flintlock guns because these see, my tongue gets tied up. Comprised the majority of firearms sold in the fur trade, and because these weapons, rather than later models of repeating firearms, were said to have had an important impact on military relations among different Aboriginal groups in the plains and subarctic. Chapter 6 will compare injuries from arrows and bullets, and Chapter 7 explores some of the social and spiritual connotations of bows, arrows, quivers, and firearms. Beyond the capabilities of European weapons, Aboriginal people's way of adapting and using them contributed greatly to the impact these weapons had on Aboriginal culture. In Chapter 8, we will examine Aboriginal people's use of archery and firearms in hunting, and Chapters 9 and 10 compare and contrast important aspects for their use in combat in the central subarctic and northern plains. Following the conclusion in Chapter 11, a glossary of archery terms defines the technical archery terms and concepts appearing in this study. I could not have completed the study without the generous assistance and support of numerous individuals and institutions, like, for example, his wife. The rest is a listing of all the different people who helped him, and it's a long list, 2 pages, with a whole whack load of names that many of them I will butcher the pronunciation of, therefore I will try not to. So that's the preface of his book. I'm going to follow this in other videos by trying to read one chapter, right, until we get to the end of this book. And we'll see how it works out. And hopefully my reading will improve. I will try to show some of the illustrations that he has here. There's some pretty good ones here. You know, these are not drawn by him. There's one, for example, where he's giving the terminology of a bow. That was drawn by a woman by the name of Margaret Ann Lindsay. Is one of his collaborators. I learned a lot reading this book, and I got lucky that I was able to find a copy of it from one of his students. And it really did affect my perspective on not only the economic impact of change, cultural change, and contact between the fur traders and the Aboriginal peoples who were here, who it really is, it's the story of economics and changing technologies, and how those technologies change how you acquire or what specializations you adapt to. And society as I have difficulty putting it into words how a bow is a tool, for example, and that tool fits the need of the circumstances. We spend most of our time arguing, well, this bow is better than that bow. It's not necessarily true, because a bow from one region might not work as well in this region for these circumstances. And when you're manufacturing these bows from local materials, you're not going to get that 6-foot longbow and 250-pound draw weight, especially not in the subarctic. No, definitely not in the Arctic, where they don't have trees. So that's what this is about. Let me actually show you the book. So that's what I'm going to share with you, is the effect that this book has had on my perspective of archery, and how I actually don't think there's really such thing as this is better than that. This fits a situation better than this does. And the one thing I do know, they're all fun to shoot. See you in a little while. Keep having fun, guys.